Welcome back. Good morning, Richard. It's good to see you on this fine November morning.
Yeah, happy November.
Yep. We are,
Made it through Halloween, made it through All Souls Day,
yeah. So
and barreling toward
the
the
holiday.
holiday season.
Yep, we are almost there. And I am sure that we will have some podcasts in the next few weeks on that specific topic, sir.
Right.
But not today. Today we are going to talk about a topic that, in our prep for this podcast, we talk about different scenarios, different situations, and it's funny that we both are going through this with some of our patients where we're working with them on relationships. Of course, we do that a lot, but in particular, we've been talking to people a lot lately who are having a really difficult time transitioning out of a relationship that has ended. They're really struggling with this connection that they have with their former partner, and so we're going to talk about that a little bit today.
Right. And when I talk to people about this, especially in the early days of a breakup, when the pain is so acute, I refer to it as a pain like no other.
Mhm.
And if you've ever been in a relationship that ended, especially a relationship that you wanted the relationship to last forever, um, that's a unique kind of pain that people experience, and we want to talk a little bit about that pain, but also what we think is a useful way of managing it a little bit better. There aren't many good ways to manage this pain that you're going through, so we want to talk a little bit about that, because in the initial phase of the breakup, most of us are convinced that you just can't survive this. You just can't. This just can't be happening. And so we begin this desperate search for ways to help us get through it. How do I deal with this? How do I get the person back, or how do I deal with the finality of this breakup?
Mhm.
And usually, that desperate search for what am I going to do? How am I going to manage this? Leads us in two directions. One is that some people advocate that, well, you're going through a grief process,
Right.
so you have to go through these steps of the grief process. And the other thing you run into, if you do a Google search, or you go online, or you talk to friends, the second avenue is advice columns. This is what you do when you have a breakup. All right. And so we want to first talk about the grief process in these romantic relationships.
Yeah. And we've talked about the grief process before, and it's this there's these various categories or various ways in which we respond to grief. We often talk about them as steps, but they're not really steps. You don't go through them one after the other. But and you can be in one stage of grief, like denial or
Right.
anger or something like that, and you could get out of that stage, but then you can go back to it again. And so it's really helpful from the perspective of trying to understand what you're feeling, and understand maybe even that what you're feeling is normal, that most people who are going through a loss, and the ending of a relationship is very much a loss,
Oh,
it's almost like the death of a loved one. So it can help sort of framing it, but it's not necessarily going to get you to the end any faster. It's like you still have to go through all of that. And so it helps in some ways, but it's not necessarily sufficient with everybody.
right. Yeah, the grief process, that five-step process that we typically think of by Karen Kubler-Ross. We typically think of those five steps, and the first step is denial. Okay, the first, and of course, that's exactly what most of us. This cannot be over. This cannot. There's not. This cannot end. I'm not ready for this to end. So the first step is denial. Going through those steps, and you will go through something like that five-step grief process. That's informative, but it doesn't do much to relieve the pain. I know what I'm going through, but I'm not able to do anything about it. And the difference is if you're dealing with the death of a loved one, there's a finality to that.
Right.
If that's over, there's no way that you're going to get that back. You can deny all you want, but you're not going to get that back. With a person who's still living, the person who broke up with you, there is always this possibility. And so it's a different kind of grief. Similar steps, different kind
Right.
of grief.
Right. And and it's so it is a fascinating thing because you're right with when there's grief from a loss, from the death of a loved one or something, it is very much so that finality to it that,
Mhm.
okay, the person is gone. They're you're not going to see them anymore. But when it's a breakup, that person is still out there, and
Right.
then you we live in a relatively small town, and so you run into them, you see them, you start thinking about them with someone else, and all of those emotions just keep churning, and as you said, it's informative to think about it through that grief process, but it's not necessarily going to relieve any of those pains that we feel in those situations.
Exactly. So what we say about grief as it relates to this process is it's one of those things that's necessary but not sufficient.
Right.
Okay. It's not going to get you to where you need to be because this kind of grief is different. So that moves us to the second avenue, which is the advice givers. I call them the advice givers. And there are plenty of those around. Okay. If you
So
go do a Google search, like how do I survive a romantic breakup? It's going to take you days to get through all of the advice that people give.
yeah.
But the problem I have, and I don't know how you are with this, Bernie, but the problem I have with these advice articles, whether it's for depression or anxiety or this romantic breakup, is it usually becomes a fruitless search, especially in the early days of the breakup. And there are several reasons for this, but the one I struggle with the most is that I use the word sterile. These advice columns are sterile. And the reason they're sterile is that an advice column, and you and I write advice columns
Mhm.
every once in a while, they're written in the tranquility of a well-stocked office when you're calm, and it's an academic undertaking. Okay, it's an academic discipline, and they're written in these well lit offices with then they get edited and they're proofed, and I'll write something and I'll send it to you and say, hey, what do you think of this? Well, that's fine as an academic undertaking, but it doesn't help. I don't think it helps with the person who's going through the hurricane of a breakup. Okay, here's this person who's filled with anxiety and passion and fear and yet they're reading this academic article,
Mhm.
and it leaves you kind of cold. They leave me kind of cold.
Well, it leaves you feeling like it sounds like this should be easy. Why is it so hard for me? Um,
You know, I'm
and,
I'm I'm on fire and somebody's off.
right. And they're saying, you know what, just spend time with your other friends,
That's right.
and I remember, a few years ago, went through some challenging relational issues, and I remember you were just describing it as they're written in a well-lit office and they're edited and proofed and everything, and I remember being in a very dark bedroom in bed for
In a
you know
fetal position.
for like 24 hours and thinking, and you look back on it and you're like, man, that was a tough time. And
Right.
I do this for a living and I talk to people about this stuff all the time. And as you said, we write about this stuff all the time. But when you're actually living it, I always pull back to that experience that I had because it's it's not as easy as those advice
Mhm.
givers make it sound. It's not
Right.
like you can just say, "Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, this relation, you know what? I'm a lot better off with this relationship being over. I'm a lot better off just moving forward with my life and everything is going to be just fine. It's going to be, there is, I know when I was in that position, there is no way that I was thinking that.
Like that. I can assure you I wasn't. But you're absolutely right. And um, so, you look at that stuff and you say, well, yeah, someday these seem okay, but I need to do something before I get there. There's something, and we all have that feeling that there's something I need to do before I can get to these 5 steps or these 6 steps of healing, okay, of being with other friends. I don't want to be with other friends. I want to be with her or him. I don't want to go out and exercise. I want to crawl on my hands and knees back to her or to him. And so, yes, this is helpful, but it's not helpful when you're lying in a dark room in a fetal position in pain because the most important thing in your life is gone. So one is this sterility, the coldness of these academic articles. The second is what I call the yeah, right phenomenon. We see this with articles about depression. They're carefully organized and they tell you what to do when you're depressed. And and said that I don't feel like doing anything. And then the advice columns say, well, that's the time when you have to get up and get going. Well, if I could get up and get going, I wouldn't be depressed. Okay, so please, there has to be something
Right.
else. There has to be something before I get there. The last thing you need when you're in this is to be told to do anything because the problem is you can't do anything. And so for people to say, well, you got to get up and get going. I don't want to get up and get going. So how do I get to get up and get going? Okay. Um, so I know I should do these things that you're telling me to do, but I can't, or I don't want to, or I don't feel like it, or something. So how do I get to that point where I can at least start the healing process?
Absolutely. And again, it goes back to, the advice giver makes it sound like this should be something easy to
Yeah.
do, and I
Mhm.
can't. And so sometimes I can make the person feel even worse.
Right.
You
Yeah, right.
have to be really careful. So, you know, these advice givers, it is good advice. We're not trying
Mhm.
to say that it's wrong or it's incorrect or anything like that. It's useful, but it's not necessarily helpful, again, especially at the beginning process of dealing with the loss of an important romantic relationship. Um, and all of these are really good things, but when you feel like you can barely breathe, you're not going to go out for a jog. Like, when you feel like you can't move, you're not going to get up and go out with your other friends. It's just
Right.
really,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. It's like you sit there and say to yourself, "Well, I know I should do all these things, but right now I can barely breathe, right? And I'm in so much I can't even read this stuff, let alone do it." Okay. So it's necessary, but there seems to be something that I have to do before I can get to those advice columns. And for us, I think one of those things we want to present here is called attachment theory because that may give you that first step to get to the advice columns. All
right.
right. And so we've talked about attachment theory before. Um, and and we found this article by a woman, Susan Whitburn, and she calls it 6 degrees of yearning. Now, we changed this a little bit to fit the podcast, but um, we're gonna discuss 5 of the 6, but it begins the attachment theory begins with a single important notion, and that is that a breakup, a romantic relationship does to our brain what drugs do to our brain.
Right.
They activate the same chemicals, they activate the same structures. And in fact, recent MRI studies have shown that a romantic relationship and drugs activate the same emotional and sensory circuits in our brain. So if you think about a romantic relationship as a drug, as something that will do what a drug does,
Yeah.
then you can begin to see that the pain you're experiencing is withdrawal.
Right.
It's like, and it is physical,
Yeah.
and it is chemical, and it is emotional, and it is sensory. So if you think about the breakup as you are going through withdrawal,
Right.
and withdrawal is painful. We all know that. Okay.
And this is one of
But
the reasons why we've talked before about how it's difficult because we attribute addiction to so many things, whether it's cell
right,
phones or
right,
technology or internet or all these different things. And yes, relationships release those same chemicals as well. And so,
right,
you know, and it is a similar process to addiction, but it may not be too surprising that we're going to say we're not going to exactly follow an addiction plan, you know,
right,
like we would, you know, for alcohol abuse or something like that.
right.
So
Mm,
it's important that we recognize that that there's a chemical process to this, that
right,
there is a biological basis for this. And as you said, you know, it kind of goes back to attachment theory. And when we've talked about attachment theory before, we've talked about it as it relates to parenting, you know, between
right,
the parent and the child, that attachment. But in our intimate relationships, or, you know, in any of our relationships, really, there is an aspect of attachment theory that's connected to that. And it is important that we look at how that theory, that idea of attachment intersects with these other relationships.
right.
Because it does very much so become a biological thing.
Right. Yeah, when you think of that about this wonderful relationship that you have, and you finally fall in love with somebody, and your brain is bathed in those feel-good chemicals, dopamine and serotonin, everything's flowing, oxytocin. Your brain, think of your brain as just being bathed in these wonderful feel-good chemicals. And that's why in the early stages of a relationship, the honeymoon phase, you can't stay off the phone. You're calling her constantly. You're seeing her. You just cannot stay away, just like a drug. Okay. And so if you think about that, that gives you a place to start this process. And the second thing is what you're feeling. This author, Whitburn, she refers to it as yearning. And I think that's a good word. You feel this yearning because this partner has provided you with validation. He or she has made you feel wonderful.
Mhm.
Safety, security. I finally found my soulmate. This is somebody who finally really understands me.
Right.
And when these are lost, when they're suddenly taken away, here's your brain bathed in the wonderful feel-good chemicals. Suddenly one day it stops.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, your brain is still seeking, it's after all those things, and you want to get it back. Okay. So you yearn for these feelings to return.
Mhm.
Now, before we begin, we're not yearning, we yearn for the person,
Right.
but what we're really yearning for are these feelings.
Right.
But we get stuck on yearning for the person, the delivery system, rather than the feelings.
Exactly. It's we have connected those feel good emotions, those feel good chemicals. We have connected those to that person, to that specific object. What we just refer to, whether it's the object is a person, or the object is alcohol, or the object is gambling. You know, we connect those feel good feelings and emotions and chemicals to that particular thing or person,
Mhm.
and then then that yearning is for that person or that thing, and it becomes confusing to us because we think that it's only that person that can make us feel that way again, when
Right.
really, you know, we really just are looking for those chemicals again.
That's right. And so if you if you think about this yearning, you want to attach, okay? But attachment has two dimensions. And you need to understand this about yourself, because your ability to deal with this is going to depend on your attachment to others. And attachment has two dimensions. One is fear, and the other is avoidance.
Right.
So fear is fear of abandonment.
Mhm.
and how fearful are you that you're going to be abandoned? And you got to think about that and you have to be honest about it. Are you don't care at all, or you care too much? And then the other is avoidance. And avoidance is avoidance of closeness. And there are people who are terrified, absolutely terrified to get too close to anybody because they're afraid that they're going to get hurt or they're afraid that the person is going to leave. So
Right,
when you think about your attachment style, think about it in two dimensions. One is fear and the other is avoidance.
right. Absolutely.
Okay.
And so as you're thinking about that, you can consider, what was it that your partner provided you?
Yeah.
Sometimes those that partner can provide, support or security, or they were just a good companion. They may have been there to boost you up when you were feeling down. They may have given lots of reassurance.
Mhm.
Um, and so what was it that your partner provided you that you're now missing, that you feel that you don't have now that the relationship is over?
Right.
Because that's going to help you identify what it is that you're yearning for, really. That's what you're really looking for. If you feel unsafe where you live because now you're alone in this apartment or this house and you don't feel safe,
Mhm.
well, perhaps it's something that you can do to increase your security, that you can increase your sense of safety. Maybe that's what you need to give you a little bit better of a sense of, reassurance, that safety, that security that you need.
Right. Now, what she does, and this gets a little bit academic, but we're going to try to simplify it and make it more personal, more emotional rather than academic. She talks about five things. She talks about six, but we're only going to talk about five. And if you think of these five as on a continuum from very little to a great deal, so a little to a lot. The first is attachment anxiety. How anxious are you um, about this loss? Okay. And some of us are kind of right in the middle, and some of us are just undone by it. So first of all, where is your attachment anxiety? And you need to gauge that. Okay, that's the first one.
Absolutely. The
The
second
second is rumination.
Yeah, rumination is really hard. You definitely know when it's happening, but so maybe hopefully you can recognize it. And like you said, there's that continuum where you're not really ruminating much at all, or you're
Mhm.
ruminating all the time. But how much are you dwelling on it? How much of your time is spent thinking about that relationship, or what you're
Right.
missing, or what you want to happen? Just how much time are you just churning through that over and over again, oftentimes going down different rabbit holes? But how much time are you spending just thinking about it?
Right. That's and it because thinking about it keeps your emotional brain structures going. They keep humming. Okay. And what you want to do is turn those off.
Right.
So if you're ruminating too much, you may need some help. The third is breakup stress. How much stress do you feel? Is it high stress, low stress? Now, if you think about these first three things that we talked about, anxiety, rumination, and stress, the problem is if they overwhelm you. If your anxiety or your rumination or your stress is so high that you can't get out of bed, that you can't go to work, that you can't function, you may want to think about professional help. Now, I can assure you it's going to be painful in the beginning. It'll diminish over time, just as any addiction diminishes over time. But in the beginning, these are going to be difficult. This is going to be a difficult time. So if these become debilitating, stress, anxiety, rumination, then you may want to seek some help. It's time to get some help if you can't get moving again.
Absolutely, because it is those three in particular that will stop you in your tracks. That especially the rumination. I find that just
Yeah.
you can't think of anything else, because all of your cognitive energy is spent thinking about what happened, why it happened, what you wish was different, and it just keeps going through those loops over and over again. And you can't think of anything else. So that's what leads people to not going to work and not being able to, study at school, or whatever the case may be. So yeah, these first three can be really debilitating.
Right. And that rumination one, what doesn't help is you have a whole folder of pictures, and
Right.
you have Instagram, and you have
Yeah.
Facebook, and you keep following this person on social media, and that's rumination. That's a form of rumination.
Yeah.
Okay. Very, very debilitating.
Right.
The other two are one of the first, the fourth one is desired attachment. Um, and you have all these people in your life, but there's only one. There's
Right.
this one person where this is it. This is my safe haven. This is my secure base. And they provide all these things to you. And you continue to seek the partner to fulfill your attachment desires. Okay, think about, and that's important. You're seeking the other person because you think it's the person, but it's not the person. It's this person provides you with these things.
Right.
This person is not the only person on the planet who can provide those things. It's just you happen to find that person. But remember, the person is simply delivering these functions, okay? And you will continue to feel loss until you satisfy those functions,
Right.
right? And that leads to the last one, which is feelings of yearning. We call this breakup distress.
Mhm.
Um, how much distress you feel will determine how long it's going to take you to get over this, to get over these feelings. All right. And so um, go through these five things, do a self-analysis. Where are you in these things? And what do you need to do to satisfy them? Because what you don't want to do is focus so much on the person that you don't manage these other five steps.
Absolutely. And I think that as you can see, it does sound it can sound very academic, and it can sound very theoretical and, very cognitive and just, but it's a process that if you can work through those five things and you can look at and sort of do a self-assessment. And again, as you said, Richard, a minute ago, if it is too difficult, talk to a professional and do it with
Mhm.
them, because they can help structure it for you. And while you may be ruminating on things, the therapist isn't ruminating on it, and so they can
Right.
help pull you back out of that loop to help you, focus on some other things.
Right.
But it's, as we said, it's not that the person is the one that's necessary
Mhm.
for that attachment, that feeling, those emotions that you're looking for. It's these chemicals, or it's this that attachment perhaps. um it's the same thing that drugs or anything else that we get really good feelings from. It's the same kind of thing that happens, but we have to recognize that there's other mechanisms, there's other ways to get that same sense of attachment, that same sense of security, that same sense of safety. um and we have to sometimes let those other relationships go so that we can find the ones that we're looking for, the ones that we need next.
Right. Where a therapist is helpful, and I think you touched on it again, is a therapist can help you sort out what where you might be stuck. If you're still, one of the things I would ask a person, you're trying to get over this breakup. Well, what have you done with all the pictures that you have of her or him? All those fond memories that you have. Are you still going back to those? Because if you keep doing that, that means you're stuck at rumination, and your therapist can help you work through that. If you have an attachment problem with your parents, if you grew up with a narcissistic parent, or you felt you were abandoned by your parents, then it's that abandonment
Right.
that's interfering with your recovery from the breakup. Um, and so make sure, I mean, be aware of these things,
Mhm.
but a good therapist can take you through these things and help you identify where you're stuck, why you're stuck, and what you can do about it, so that you can then get to the advice columns. And then you can start, okay, now I feel better and I can do these things.
Absolutely. And certainly, we're certainly not saying that you have to get rid of all the memorabilia of that phase of your life, because there's certainly some things that you probably want to remember and you want to hold on to.
Right.
you know, it's different, when when a relationship ends and you have these things that constantly remind you of that other person, and if there is an interest in holding on to it, putting it in a plastic bin and putting it up in the attic, it's different
Right.
than having it in your bedroom, out on the table or whatever, so that you
Right.
see it all the time. So,
Right.
so packing some of that stuff away is part of the process of letting it go. Not following and looking at their Facebook, not looking at their Instagram or Snapchat or whatever, because that's going to keep everything raw and hurting. And so you have to move on from that. And it's tough. It is very tough, but
It's a pain like no other. And we understand that there's nothing worse than the pain of a breakup, especially one that you didn't want to break up. So,
absolutely. All right. Well, I
okay.
think that's it for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.